My name is Pablo Miralles, and I am the president of Arroyo Seco Films.
You lost your home in the Eaton fires taking place in LA.
I think it's been now 9 days since the loss of my home, and every day I felt something different.
Yeah.
Initially, you're thankful that you have your life, especially thankful that my child, my son, is safe. My wife, I would have said initially was lucky to be out of town. Of course, now she wishes she'd been there to help. We have two amazing dogs that we're happy are safe. And then you slowly, every day, kind of begin to recognize what was lost. Some things like, I had this, your personal collections that matter so much to you, suddenly you realize are not important. I had a collection of soccer jerseys I started around 1982.
Wow.
Every time, it's funny because like I used to joke that my mom would go to us when she traveled, she would come back with one of those little teaspoons, like that was her thing. Well, I would go and get a soccer jersey. So I had them from all over the world, every
Wow.
city I ever went to. And because it got so big at some point, they just ended up being in a crate in the garage. It was um and so really, I didn't even see them for like a decade, 2 decades. I wouldn't even. So what value does that have, really? They're just shirts, right? Um, and then there's things that are irreplaceable, things that are family heirlooms. Um, a painting that my wife's grandmother had made. I managed to save one or two little things from my family and her family, but there was just too much. We were, for my family, I mean, I grew up in a family of 7 kids, and I was sort of the historian in the family. So I got things that belonged to my grandfathers and grandmothers, and so I have to
Yeah.
like really think about how those things are gone. They're just
Yeah.
never can't get them back.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and but one of the big foundations, California Communities Foundation, who's mind you, any listener out there wants to help the larger LA community, they're one of the best places to support.
Okay. What's your situation right now and what are your plans?
I am blessed, like I mentioned, with a very large family, um, and amazing friends. My son and I left our former house and went to stay with my best friend, who was also like the best man at my wedding 35 years ago. And they took us in like it wasn't even a thought. But it was a little tight there with two dogs and the two of us. And when my wife returned from her trip overseas, we went to stay where I am now at the home of my sister-in-law, her sister,
Hmm.
and her amazing husband. And they have no kids. They have a dog that loves our dogs. They have a lot of room. We're in Ladera Heights, so it's not so far. That's near, if you don't know, it's sort of near LAX. Um, it's like Altadena, it has a traditional African American middle class, so
Hmm.
it's very comfortable here. Um, it's a nice racially diverse community as well. Um, there's a lot of families that have connections between Altadena and Ladera Heights I discovered over the years. Um, and
And
we're here until the weekend, and then we've been very lucky to find a rental out in Burbank, not too far from my wife's work in
yeah,
Glendale.
I realize it's probably still too early to be asking questions like, what are you going to do? So,
Oh no,
thank
I
you.
mean we're that's all I do all day is figure out what we're gonna do.
Yeah.
So uh,
Um,
yeah.
while you're figuring that out, you
Mm.
know, I'm sure you're trying to keep busy, and I'm sure there's enough of all of that is keeping you busy. But then
Oh yeah.
there's your work too.
Right.
And I want to spend some time talking about that because there is a very interesting connection here between you and me. And that is you put together this piece of work called Can't We All Get Along?
Mm,
That was the Rodney King story. And for those who've been listening and watching, what we do here on Colors, we started the week after George Floyd was killed
mm,
in 2020 because it we needed to do it. But the original seed for Colors was 30 years ago.
mm,
A program that I was doing with a colleague at a radio station I was working at, who actually, when we started Colors, was the co-host of this program. His name is Chris Core. He and I did this program in the back in the 90s called Black and White, and it
mm,
was started because of the Rodney King beating. So having this opportunity to talk to you about what brought you to do that um, is pretty important to me, and I think to our audience too. So can you tell me about that and how, well, I know that that's not a top of mind thing now,
mm.
but tell
No,
me about that and about that history from your neighborhood, your high school, those things.
yeah. So I'll do a brief thumbnail. I Around the 30th reunion of my high school, I was introduced to a very wonderful former schoolmate who has since passed away, who was telling us how lucky we were to go to Pasadena schools during the 70s during full desegregation busing. And when you're part of some sort of a social movement, especially a positive one that no longer exists, you don't really think, oh, I don't know, were we really lucky? I don't know. It doesn't seem like the rest of the world thinks we were. Fast forward a couple of years, and I really started recognizing that I had had a lucky childhood. Um, Briefly, my immigrant father and mother bought a house on a street in West Altadena that was entirely black, middle class. And my earliest best friends were all black. And I feel that my life was enriched beyond measure by such exposure to the black community that we moved into. My father discovered institutional racism when he tried to get a home loan for this house that he wanted to move his family into, and discovered that his bank in LA would not give him a loan because it was in a black neighborhood. He found um, he found support in he was an architect. He is an architect. I mean, he's retired, but he's still alive. Um, that other black architects in Los Angeles led them to Broadway Savings and Loan, which was the first black-owned bank in Los Angeles, where he got a home loan to buy the house that he really wanted. And he cannot tell that story without tearing up. So that recognition that and all the experiences that happen when you're a white kid growing up in a black neighborhood, it's always seen as really negative. And I can tell you, every child in America should do summer camp in a black neighborhood. And that's my opinion. They would have a much better idea of what it is. I like to tell the story about my best friend at the time, Kevin, and I would go. This Altadena is right up against the mountains. It's right against the
Right,
national forest.
right,
Our backyard was the forest, basically, the trails we knew like the back of our hands. We used to like to play army. As kids do back in the day when kids were feral and we didn't have Xboxes and stuff. And so we would grab sticks that looked like guns, except no, I decided to grab my older brother's BB gun and let's go. I'm gonna be really tough. It didn't have any BBs in it, but I could like pow 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 with an actual gun. And we're walking down the street, and Kevin's dad comes running out. He was a probation officer, and he says, "Don't hold that gun." To Kevin, I could hold the gun on the street, but Kevin couldn't hold the gun on the street. I was
wow,
7 years old.
wow.
I was like, holy. I mean, in some ways, I didn't 100% understand it, but as I grew up. Now, all of the west side of Pasadena and Altadena had this history of integration. It's in the film. And the actual title, if anyone's interested, is called Can We All Get Along? the segregation of John Muir High School. I'm going to loop back to how this all started. I'm thank you for the grace of saying I can say anything I want because I haven't like talked about this film in a while. Although it will be nationally broadcast on the World Channel later next month.
Hmm.
Um, so um, yeah, so this community it was a place where Japanese Americans coming out of internment camp could get homes, middle class
Yeah.
homes. uh, Blacks had moved in to the west side of Pasadena ever since this town started because at one point Pasadena, which is right next door, was the wealthiest city in the United States for decades. And for these super wealthy families, there was nothing better than or status was shown by having a black cook and a black butler and a Japanese gardener, right? So these jobs were so well paid that a lot of the Great Migration, who initially might have landed in like LA, they said, "Oh man, I can make more money up in Pasadena," so they moved up there. And redlining meant that they were in a very small part of Northwest Pasadena. That's the place where they built John Muir High School. And if you know, John Muir High School is where Jackie Robinson went, and so the that
Yes,
was
and Jackie Robinson is on full display here. If folks are
yes.
looking at your baseball cap, the Brooklyn
Yes, I
Dodgers.
got the Bruins. You got the Dodgers. He's covered.
Yeah. So
Yeah, and
sorry to
so
interrupt. Go ahead.
no. Uh, and his his he's a great representative of the Pasadena community
Hmm.
of a lot of truly creative people moved into that neighborhood. Altadena was West Altadena didn't have the same segregation issues that West Pasadena had because it was in the county, not in the city. But it was still predominantly white until the mid 60s, right? Because the values of the homes were
Right.
high enough that it was just economically unfeasible. The Watts riots in 65 meant that there was a certain amount of white flight, which lowered values enough so that black families could start moving in. For example, the street I moved into, it's a great example. We came in 1971, 1 year after busing started. Um, I had assumed that, the Stewarts across the way and that beautiful craftsman, or I guess it's like semi-Victorian home, or the Hardys like directly across the street, and the Flemings and the Millers and the Washingtons. These are all our neighbors, had been living there for decades. Their houses are beautiful, mid-century for the most part, except for a couple of them. We moved into this really amazing house that uh, had belonged to a white family. So
Yeah.
we and it used to own all the land around it, which was kind of interesting because it had been subdivided in the early 60s. And but then I found out later that they had only moved into the neighborhood maybe 5, 6 years at the most before us, once
Yeah.
those neighborhoods opened up. Um, so we were all kind of in a way starting new, at least in that part. There had been just down the road on the border of Pasadena, there's this family, the Pattons,
Right.
who I've known since elementary school, but I had no idea that their family have roots into Pasadena that go back to the early 1900s.
Right. So
Uh,
Pablo, let me
yeah,
let me let me interrupt. We'll get back to that in just a
sure,
second.
sure. Sorry.
But do you know if those structures are still there?
Oh yeah, that street didn't get touched. It was far west Altadena. The line of destruction was along this street called Lincoln,
Yeah.
which if you think of the town of Altadena and you move west to east, the first major street is Lincoln.
Yeah.
So it was only 3 or 4 blocks on the far west that were pretty much 100% spared. And
Right.
um, that's my neighborhood that I grew up in. What did burn though was my elementary school,
Right.
which is highlighted in my film called
Right.
Franklin. It burned down.
Right.
Um, and
Yeah.
yeah, so and then you got Fair Oaks, which is the actual heart and center of the black and brown and Asian communities, which, if you draw a straight line down, was like where Jackie Robinson grew off of,
Yeah.
in Pasadena. And then you've got Marengo, which is the heart of the fire. Then you've got Lake, which was the major artery with all the businesses that burned. Allen, which was some was saved, some were not. And then you end up at Eaton Canyon where the fire started.
Now, your family,
Yeah.
is all your family okay? And your
No,
friends?
my brother who's 1 year older than me lost his home as well. Um,
Okay. I'm sorry.
and amazingly, he's a pretty well-known violin maker. And he had a shop. It's crazy, but it was in a canyon up in the mountains
Hmm.
where we always told him that's fire crazy up there. The fire engines came and get up there half the time. That's it survived. The cabin survived. 110-year-old cabin,
Wow.
no problem. His house down in the flats where we always thought we were completely safe, that burned. Um,
Yeah.
uh, I have a ton of extended family. I think that five at this point, at this count, mainly in-laws and ex-in-laws, I should say. But people that I've known forever, they lost their homes too. Most of those were on the east side of Altadena.
Yeah. Let's jump into the speed round of questions now,
Sure.
because I want to get all this stuff in.
Yeah.
What about your work? Is your work safe, or did you lose work?
I lost all of my analog. So I started film school in 1987. I
Uh-huh.
used to shoot in 16 millimeter film. All my prints, all my negatives are gone. I did digitize one or two pieces a while ago, so those are safe or viewable. Mind you, I don't I don't watch them. I think they're student films, and I prefer not many people see them. But
Yeah.
they meant something to me. Um, a lot of the like I used to sell merch for Can We All Get Along? It had
Right.
2 years
Yeah.
ago,
Yeah.
it had been Emmy nominated, and so I was suddenly selling a lot of T-shirts and DVDs and things of that nature. That all went up, so had to tell my web person to take down my store.
Yeah.
Um, the I managed to save, I think, I haven't been able to test them. The hard drives were all my original raw footage of the for Can We All Get Along was on.
Yeah.
Um, I threw them in our second car and backed the car away from the house, and luckily the car did not burn.
Hmm.
There are quite a few boxes,
Hmm.
large 8 terabyte hard drives. I've got to still plug in at some point and see if the heat
Well,
didn't ruin it.
fingers are crossed that they still work.
Yeah.
Two can we get along? Tell our younger audience members what that is, and why it's important, and how you came about to do that story.
Sure. So during my research for that film, I'd always known that Rodney King grew up in my neighborhood. But I had no idea he grew up 2 blocks from me and that he was actually at my high school at the same time I was. He was
Wow.
2 years younger.
Wow.
And so looking in the yearbook, for example, my senior yearbook, and seeing his picture, 20 pages away from mine was kind of like, whoa. So when he had said, "Can we all get along?" I remember back when that happened. I knew instinctively, because I knew that he was from my neighborhood, that he wasn't talking rhetorically. He knew that we could, because he grew up in completely diverse environment. He went to the same elementary school as me. He went to the same middle school as me. He went to the same high school as me. Um, as with all things racial in the United States, it's never perfect. In fact, it's far from perfect. But at least in the 1970s and 80s, early 80s, in Pasadena and Altadena, it was as good as it was going to get in the United States, right? And we as children had no idea how lucky we were, as my friend Cameron had told me.
Yeah.
And so knowing that he had had the same experience growing up as me, and knowing that um, how people reacted to him, both in the white and black communities, on the edges, not everybody, but the whites who wanted to defend the police. Interestingly, the Sergeant Powell, who was probably the most egregious of the police uh, in that episode, went to a rival high school that was sort of this one of those schools that grew very quickly in the 60s and 70s as people fled Pasadena because the black population had been growing. So it was sort of a white flight high school. Um, so to think that, maybe they could have been neighbors themselves, except that, there certain a group of parents decided they wanted to move to an all-white neighborhood, and they raised a child who could beat a black child who could have been their neighbor, his neighbor. That
Right.
badly was something I never put in the film, but it was always something in the back of my mind.
Right.
Yeah.
That that's
Yeah.
an extraordinary story, and I would encourage people to go watch that film and to watch and read the history of what took place on that street that night, and to sort of look at where we are today as so many companies and organizations that were jumping on the diversity bandwagon
Mm.
4 or 5 years ago are now
Yeah.
reversing and going back to the same ideology that they were in at the time when George Floyd came along. And frankly, there was this moment after Rodney King, where we thought there might be some kind of reconciliation. But then not too long after that came Malice Green in Detroit and
Mm.
other situations. And my friend and former colleague and former host of Colors told me when we started this, he said, and I remember him very clearly saying this. We were talking, I think, to the former mayor of Milwaukee about
Mm.
something. And he was saying essentially, there's gonna be a backlash to this. It's coming. And I looked at him and I said, "What are you talking about?" But he was right. I mean, and the backlash that we're getting now is far worse than I think anybody expected. I mean, this rises from the grassroots all the way up to the top of power. So just wondering how you feel about things right now, race in
Well,
America.
I'm gonna just piggyback on what you just said. I was noticing there are a couple of plot points in my film. One, the Watts riots in '65, which led to the white flight that allowed the community I grew up in to exist in a middle class neighborhood. Then there were the Rodney King riots, which I lived through. I was living and working in LA at the time. And then what I was trying to come to terms with was that so in LA, we didn't have a major black because you there in the late 60s there was the Chicano movement riots, but there was no uprising between 65 and 92. And it hit me kind of, as not as a scholar who's done the research or anything else. This is just me emotionally thinking, when we felt that the larger society, the government, the culture at large was trying to solve these problems, right, of racial inequality. We didn't have huge racial uprisings, right? But you get to like 92, now you see that, at least in my view, the backlash against, the Great Society sort of started with Reagan in 80. And it took that much time of dismantling integration
Yeah,
initiatives. Um, Affirmative action was starting to be questioned for the first time openly by people in power because it was considered, for a little while, oh yeah, we need to do this. And now suddenly, well, it's the term reverse discrimination came into the lexicon. And it was something I remember talking to people about in college in the late 80s that, it's gotten to the point white people would say, well, white people suffered too, or, you can't let someone into a college who's got lower scores. That's not fair. And it's like, you have no idea. They've gone through 400 years of discrimination. This is where they're getting their first really good opportunity, right? But they can't see that, right? They think of equality as merely color blind, and that's
right.
not what our country is about. So, yeah, here we are. Now, finally coming to your point. Yeah, after Floyd was a great example, right?
Yeah,
We all these white liberals putting out BLM signs in their yard, and that was there to show solidarity, but then may have within 8 years voted for Donald Trump because of inflation.
right.
So, excuse me, but um, either you care about what true diversity, equity, and inclusion and access are, and you're willing to maybe pay a little bit more for milk and gas in order to help your neighbor have a better life, build generational wealth. I was just talking to my friend who's he was a classmate of mine at Muir, who is the editor of the one of the local online newspapers, Pasadena Now, and he's black. He lost his family's home, the way
Yeah,
where he grew up.
yeah,
After a divorce, he moved back, was helping take care of his mom. And he said this was it. This was all his family had, right? There's
wow.
no, like me, I'm lucky. I've got, every single one of my brothers and sisters owns a home. Uh, Most have a fairly successful career. Um, Being not black in the United States is an easy gateway. And immigrants who vote against the interests of the black community can never quite understand how have jumped the line merely by choosing to go to the United States and not being stolen from their homeland and brought to work for free and being considered property. And that
Yeah,
legacy doesn't go away in 100 years.
no, I can tell
It,
you how it happens. And it happens because um, the thing that's going on in this country and around the world right now is people have moved on from what we were raised with, Pablo, and that's this idea of right is right.
hmm,
There are people who are interested in right when it benefits them. And when doing right doesn't benefit you, there are people who aren't willing to do it. Ernie Green, who goes to my church here in Washington, as you know, is a member of the Little Rock Nine from
yeah.
the 50s. And he told me in our last interview last year, I think, he said, one of the things that we were told back then, he said, Dr. King told us and others, is that we need to be prepared to for people to hate us, you know? So you can't just do the right thing as long as people like you and then don't do the right thing when people don't like you and things aren't going well. So, yeah, there's this convenience that a lot of people have applied. Some of the same people that I've seen jumping up and down and crying and just putting on all kinds of histrionics after George Floyd was killed and Rodney King was beaten and so many other tragedies, they've now decided, oh, well, I'm done. I've done enough. I've done all I can, so I'm gone. That's how it happens, bro. That's to
No,
me.
and we do have a real terrible um, sense of history, or the white uh, culture in general doesn't have. I mean, a couple of years ago, some comedian said that slavery wasn't that far away. It was two 70-year-old grandmothers back to back. Um, and people they don't think of it in that way. They think of it in their own personal history,
Yeah.
right? That's history. That's not history.
The thing is, and I don't know, I want to finish up because we got to
Oh yeah, sorry.
wrap it up soon. But I want to finish up talking about you and your situation. But
Oh.
I'm just going to say this: um, people really need to wake up. I
Mm.
mean, when you see a guy like Zuckerberg. And I don't know how many black folks are on Facebook or people of color are on Facebook. When you see what he did and
Yeah.
what Musk and others are doing with relationship to diversity, etc., think about where you're putting your money and your time and think about those platforms that you're using. Think about TikTok, what the
Mm,
Chinese are doing. I mean, these are things that we need to think about.
I
And
agree.
I can't say enough about having you on this program today to highlight that in the midst of your struggling and your suffering. We got about a couple minutes left, but I'm wondering if you could just wrap up what you're thinking,
Yeah.
what you'd like us to remember here.
Okay, well, if you'd like to watch my film, it's on pbs.org. Just search Can We All Get Along? I'm in the process of finishing a film about Owen Brown, who was the son of the abolitionist John Brown, who
Yep.
settled in Altadena before there was an Altadena. He was a homesteader in the 1800s. It does speak to the roots of that area that abolitionists were supported there. And I just started another project. John Muir High School, which I did the movie on, has been one of the schools that has started doing early college access, dual enrollment. My son is a sophomore there,
Yeah.
so he's been able to take college classes while in high school. This has proved to be very helpful for children who don't have parents who went to college, who might have never thought of college as an option. I touched on it in the film Can We All Get Along? That's my work life, more than anything, just taking care of my son, and my
Right.
wife is taking care of me.
Well, you know what? I wish you the best. We'll be praying for you and hope that things get better soon, and we will not make this a one and done. We'll be back to you. Thank you so much, Pablo, for talking to
Thank,
us.
thank you, JJ. It was a pleasure meeting you.